The man who almost conquered Europe was stopped not by a rival empire, a great general, or a superior army. He was stopped by mud, and by the fact that he arrived 3 weeks too late. Suleiman the Magnificent commanded the largest, most advanced military force on earth. He had shattered kingdoms, reduced fortresses to rubble, and brought the entirety of the eastern Mediterranean under his banner. No Christian king had stood against him and won. His janissaries were the most feared infantry in the world. His artillery had leveled walls that other armies considered impregnable. He had never in his entire career as Sultan failed to take a city he had chosen to besiege. And yet, Vienna held. Not because the defenders were stronger, not because the city's walls were extraordinary. They were not. Vienna's fortifications in 1529 were medieval, crumbling in places, and laughably inadequate compared to what Ottoman siege engineers had dismantled in Belgrade, Rhodes, and Buda. Not because the Holy Roman Empire had finally marshaled its full military strength. It had not. The Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Christian monarch in Europe, sent fewer than 2,000 soldiers to Vienna before the siege began, and he spent most of the campaign months away from the city entirely. 20,000 defenders against 150,000 attackers. A medieval wall against the finest siege train in the known world. And yet the minarets never rose above the Stephenstone. The crescent never flew over the Hofburg. Suleiman turned his army around and marched home in the rain. And the moment he left, the course of Western history pivoted on a hinge that most people never examine closely enough. This video is about what actually happened at Vienna in 1529 and why almost everything the popular narrative gets right about this siege still misses the real story. By the end of it, you will understand why Vienna was not primarily a military victory. It was a logistical catastrophe suffered by the greatest army of the age, triggered by decisions made months before the first arrow was fired, and why that distinction matters more than anything else that happened in those extraordinary weeks in late September and October of 1529. Before we go inside every skirmish, every mine and countermine, every desperate sortie and failed assault that defined this siege, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the terrain, the tactics, the political machinery, and the human decisions behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this story reaches further than people realize, and it deserves to be told properly. That is exactly what we are going to do. To understand why Vienna was even possible, why Suleiman would march an army from Constantinople to the gates of Central Europe at all, you have to understand the world that existed in the spring of 1529, and how completely that world had been reshaped in the decade before. Go back 15 years. In 1514, the Ottoman Empire under Selim I had already crushed the Safavid Persians at Chaldiran, absorbing vast territories to the east. By 1517, Selim had swept through Egypt, ending the Mamluk Sultanate and absorbing the Levant, Arabia, and North Africa into the Ottoman sphere. When Selim died in 1520 and his 26-year-old son Suleiman inherited the throne, the empire he received was already the largest and wealthiest military state in the world. The Ottomans controlled the land routes between Europe and Asia. They collected revenue from trade that would make most European kingdoms weep. Their bureaucracy administered territories that stretched from the Hungarian plains to the Persian Gulf. And Suleiman, from the first year of his reign, made absolutely clear what he intended to do with all of it. In 1521, he took Belgrade. This matters enormously, and it does not get enough attention. Belgrade was not simply a city, it was the gateway, the single most important fortified position on the northern frontier, the stronghold that the Hungarians had used for over a century as the stopper in the bottle, the one obstacle that had repeatedly prevented Ottoman armies from pouring into Central Europe. The Hungarians had known this, which is why they had fortified it so heavily. It fell to Suleiman in August 1521 after a siege of less than 3 months. The door to Central Europe was now open. In 1522, Suleiman took Rhodes, ejecting the Knights Hospitaller from the island fortress they had held for over 2 centuries, and removing the most capable naval power defending the eastern Mediterranean from Christian hands. Europe was watching all of this, and Europe was, with a few isolated exceptions, doing almost nothing coherent in response. This is the part that defies modern comprehension. The Ottoman advance was not a secret. It was not even particularly fast. There was time, in theory, to organize resistance, but the Holy Roman Empire in the 1520s was a political disaster in slow motion. Charles V, who held the title of emperor, was also king of Spain, and he was simultaneously managing the Spanish conquest of the Americas, a catastrophic sack of Rome by his own mutinous troops in 1527, ongoing conflict with France under Francis I, and the early theological earthquake of Martin Luther's Reformation, which was splitting his German territories in half. The empire was not a coherent military state. It was a patchwork of rival princes, free cities and ecclesiastical territories, each with their own interests, each distrustful of the others, and none of whom could agree on how to respond to anything. Hungary, the country most directly in the path of what was coming, was in an equally catastrophic condition. Its king, Louis III, was 20 years old in 1526, inexperienced and commanding an army that was badly organized, underfunded, and deeply divided between factions of nobles more interested in preserving their own privileges than defending the kingdom. When Suleiman marched north through the Balkans in the summer of 1526, the Hungarians rode out to meet him on the plain of Mohacs. What happened at Mohacs on the 29th of August 1526 lasted less than 2 hours. The Hungarian army was destroyed, completely. King Louis III died fleeing the field, drowned in a stream while his horse panicked. The nobility of Hungary was decimated. The army that might have defended the country ceased to exist. Within weeks, Suleiman had entered Buda, the Hungarian capital, essentially unopposed. He did not stay, and this is the first point at which the story becomes strange. Suleiman took Buda, garrisoned it lightly, and withdrew. He left a client king on the Hungarian throne, John Zápolya, a Hungarian noble who had been conveniently absent at Mohacs, and returned to Constantinople. From a purely military standpoint, with the road to Vienna wide open and the balance of Central Europe in total shock, this seems like an extraordinary restraint. The reason was logistical. The campaign season was ending. His army had marched enormous distances in terrible heat. He could not sustain a siege of Vienna with winter approaching. He knew it. He would return. Now we need to stop and correct something that almost every account of the 1529 siege gets wrong, and the mistake is so fundamental that it distorts everything that follows. The common narrative presents the Siege of Vienna as a close call, a near thing, a moment where the fate of Christendom hung by a thread, and where the defenders' heroic resistance saved Western civilization by the narrowest of margins. This is dramatically satisfying, and it is essentially backwards. Vienna in 1529 was not a close call in the way that popular history implies. It was not a situation where the defenders barely held on while Suleiman's men nearly broke through. The real story is more interesting and more devastating than that. The Siege of Vienna was an Ottoman operation that had already failed before it really began, due to catastrophic logistical decisions made in Constantinople and compounded by weather, distance, and the rigid seasonal constraints of pre-modern warfare. The city's defenders did not save Vienna so much as Vienna's geography and the Ottoman calendar saved Vienna. Understanding the difference between those two things is the key to understanding what 1529 actually means. This does not diminish what the defenders did. They were brave, resourceful, and genuinely ferocious in their resistance. But bravery in the service of a strategically impossible position is different from bravery that turns the tide. The tide in 1529 was never quite going to turn the way Suleiman needed it to. Here is what the numbers actually looked like. Constantinople to Vienna by the route Suleiman's army took is approximately 1,700 kilometers. The Ottoman army began its march in May 1529. The army that assembled for this campaign was extraordinary. Contemporary estimates, now filtered through historical analysis, suggest somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 fighting men, plus the enormous logistical tale of camp followers, servants, supply handlers, and animals that any pre-modern army required. The Ottoman siege train, the heavy artillery that had battered down walls across 2 continents, required thousands of draft animals to move. Those animals needed water, they needed fodder, they needed roads that could bear their weight. The spring of 1529 was catastrophically wet. The Balkans received rainfall far in excess of normal seasonal amounts. Rivers flooded, roads became impassable, bridges washed out, carts sank to their axles in mud that had no bottom. Suleiman's army, one of the finest military organizations in the world, found itself struggling through conditions that turned a march of weeks into a march of months. The siege artillery never made it. Read that again. The heavy cannon, the weapons that had leveled the walls of Belgrade and Rhodes, were abandoned along the road because the ground could not bear them. Bogged down in flooded river valleys, sinking in mud, impossible to extract with equipment the army did not have in sufficient quantity, the great guns were left behind, or, in some accounts, simply dragged to the nearest river and rolled in. Suleiman arrived at Vienna with a siege train that consisted primarily of lighter field artillery, weapons adequate for killing men in the open, but wholly inadequate for the systematic demolition of city walls that an Ottoman siege required. The city arrived outside Vienna on the 27th of September 1529. The weather had not improved. Inside the city, the situation looked terrifying from the outside and was genuinely dangerous from the inside, but was also, and this is the crucial point, not the existential catastrophe that later accounts would make it. The Count of Salm, Niklas I, commanded the defense. He was 69 years old. He had spent his entire career in war. He had been at Pavia in 1525 and had watched the French army destroyed. He was not a man who panicked easily or who could be intimidated by numbers alone. Salm had known the Ottomans were coming since summer. He had used every week of available time to prepare. The medieval walls of Vienna were, as mentioned, inadequate for a modern siege, but Salm had done what he could. He had torn down houses in the suburbs to clear fields of fire. He had reinforced the walls with earthworks, packed dirt behind the stonework to absorb cannon shot, a technique that had been developing across European fortification theory and that reduced the catastrophic shattering effect that artillery produced on pure stone. He had deepened the ditches, placed obstacles in the approaches, and positioned his artillery on the walls as carefully as the available emplantments allowed. He had something else working in his favor. The defenders of Vienna were not all local militia and frightened citizens. Salm had managed to concentrate a corps of experienced professional soldiers inside the walls, Spanish tercios, German Landsknechts, Bohemian troops. These were among the finest infantry in Europe, men who had fought in Italy, who understood siege warfare from both sides, who knew how to hold a wall and how to exploit the inevitable failures of even the most sophisticated attacker. Approximately 20,000 defenders, against what would prove to be an attacking force that, by the time it arrived, was already exhausted, undersupplied, and operating without its most essential weapons. The psychological situation on September 27th was surreal. Inside Vienna, the population was somewhere between near panic and determined defiance. The civilian population had been partially evacuated, women, children, the infirm, because Salm knew that feeding a large civilian population through a siege while also sustaining a garrison was logistically ruinous. He had also expelled from the city anyone he considered a security risk, a brutal calculation, but a militarily sound one. The streets of Vienna in late September 1529 were full of soldiers, not citizens. Outside the walls, the Ottoman camp stretched across the plain with a comprehensiveness that was itself a statement of power.
The colored tents of the Janissary Corps, the cavalry encampments, the commissariat train that fed this enormous army, all of it visible from the walls, all of it radiating the implicit message that resistance was futile and that delay only prolonged the inevitable. But here is where it gets interesting. Suleiman's commanders looked at the walls of Vienna, looked at the artillery they had arrived with, and understood immediately that they were not going to be able to do what they had done at Belgrade and Rhodes. They could not blow open the gates with cannon, they could not systematically reduce sections of wall to rubble and send the Janissaries through the breach into a dazed, dust-choked defense. The weapons for that approach were sitting in the mud somewhere south of Buda. So they went underground. Mining was not a new technique in 1529. Armies had been using it for centuries, digging tunnels beneath walls, packing the end chambers with combustible material, and igniting them to bring the stonework crashing down. The Ottomans had experienced miners, skilled engineers, and the manpower to dig extensive tunnel networks under the defenders' positions. If the cannon could not bring the walls down from outside, the earth could be made to bring them down from beneath. Salm had anticipated this. The defenders of Vienna had their own mining teams, and more importantly, they had an early warning system. Drums of water placed on the floors of strategic positions inside the city that would ripple and vibrate when digging was occurring beneath. Scouts listening at intervals. Miners who were also combat veterans, who understood not just how to dig, but how to fight in the dark, narrow, suffocating tunnels beneath a besieged city. What followed over the next 3 weeks was one of the most extraordinary close-quarters engagements in early modern military history. A war fought entirely underground, entirely in darkness, with picks and axes and small blades, where the distance between attacker and defender was sometimes measured in feet, and where a miscalculation in timing could collapse a tunnel on the people inside it. The Ottomans dug. The defenders dug to intercept them. Countermines reached Ottoman tunnels before the charges could be placed. In some cases, defenders and attackers broke through into each other's workings and fought in near total darkness, neither side able to see the other, both sides fighting by sound and touch, and the faint light of a lantern someone was desperately not to lose.
Shift your perspective for a moment. You are not Solomon on the wall, watching the Ottoman camp and calculating time remaining in the season. You are a Landsknecht miner, 20 feet underground, following the sound of Ottoman picks through the clay soil of the Vienna plain. You have a torch that may or may not survive the next 3 minutes. You have a knife and a short axe. The man next to you is breathing so loudly that you cannot quite tell whether the sounds coming from ahead are enemy miners or your own heartbeat. And then the wall of earth in front of you begins to move. The underground war was brutal and largely invisible to history. It produced no famous commanders, no memorable tactical formations, no moments of grand theater. It was men in holes, fighting men in other holes, and what it accomplished was the repeated interruption of Ottoman mining operations before they could produce a decisive breach. Not every attempt was stopped in time. Several mines did reach the walls, several did detonate, but the breaches they produced were never large enough or well-timed enough to allow a decisive assault. And the defenders' ability to respond quickly to breaches, to pour men into the gap before the attackers could exploit it, proved more than adequate against the forces Suleiman could commit to each assault. There were also assaults at the gates. Formal, massed attacks against the city's entry points, with Janissaries advancing under missile fire toward barriers defended by tercios and Landsknechts, who had very specific, practiced ideas about what to do with men trying to push through a narrow gap in a fortified wall. These assaults failed. They failed not because of any tactical genius on the defenders' side, though the defenders were competent and experienced,
They failed because the Janissaries, without artillery preparation to suppress the defenders on the walls above the gate, were advancing into a killing ground that the defenders had prepared for exactly this purpose. Cannon fired down from the walls. Arquebusiers, early firearms troops, added their fire to the arrow storm from the defenders' bows. The gate itself had been reinforced and blocked in ways that ensured any attacker who reached it faced additional barriers before entering the city. Men died in those approaches, many of them, and they died without breaking through. October 12th. This is the date that most accounts identify as the moment when the siege effectively ended, though fighting would continue for another 2 days. A major assault, the largest Suleiman had committed since the siege began, was launched against multiple points of the wall simultaneously. The Janissaries advanced with the ferocity and discipline that had made them legendary across 2 continents. They reached the walls in multiple places. They fought in the ditches and at the foot of the stonework. They were thrown back. In some accounts, the repulse of the October 12th assault involved the defenders mounting the walls themselves and fighting hand-to-hand with men who had climbed to the parapets. In others, the decisive moment came when the defenders flooded a section of approach with fire and the advancing formation broke. What is consistent across accounts is the result. The assault failed, and failed completely, and the Ottoman commanders who reported the outcome to Suleiman told him what he already suspected: Vienna was not going to fall this year. There is a detail from this period that most histories skip over, and it is the kind of detail that changes the emotional texture of the entire story. Among the Ottoman soldiers who participated in these final assaults were significant numbers of men who were not Janissaries at all, who were, in fact, Christian soldiers from various Balkan peoples who had been incorporated into the Ottoman military system either through the Devshirme, the levy of Christian boys for Ottoman service, or through conquest. The army besieging Vienna contained men who were, ethnically and in some cases religiously, not so different from the men defending it. This was not unusual in the conflicts of this era, but it is a corrective to the simple binary of Christian versus Muslim, East versus West, that later historiography would impose on 1529. The world of the 16th century was more complicated than that. It always is. On October 14th, Suleiman withdrew. Before he left, he ordered the camp cleared. The Ottoman army, in a final act that was partly tactical discipline and partly something that looks like rage, executed prisoners they could not take with them. The accounts vary in their precision, but there is consistent documentation that a significant number of captives taken during the siege and its surrounding operations were killed before the army withdrew. This is not unique to Ottoman armies. The killing of prisoners who could not be transported was a common practice across early modern warfare, but it sits in the record as a dark addendum to the siege's end.
Suleiman marched his army south through weather that was already turning toward winter. The campaign had cost him weeks of marching, enormous quantities of supplies, significant casualties. Estimates vary wildly, but Ottoman losses were substantial, and the political embarrassment of the first genuine failure of his reign. He had taken Belgrade and Rhodes and Buda. He had not taken Vienna. He would try again. In 1532, he assembled another army and marched north, but the strategic situation had shifted. Charles V had managed for once to organize a coherent response, and the army that assembled to oppose a second Ottoman advance was genuinely large enough to give Suleiman pause. The small fortress of Göns, now Kőszeg in modern Hungary, mounted a defense so prolonged and unexpectedly effective against the Ottoman advance guard that it consumed time the campaign could not afford. Suleiman reached the borders of Austria and turned back without ever reaching Vienna a second time. He never came again. The failure of 1529 matters in ways that go beyond the military result. Empires have momentum, and Suleiman's empire had been accumulating momentum in the European theater for a decade. Mohács had been decisive. The fall of Buda had been psychologically devastating to Christian Europe.
Rhodes had removed a crucial naval power from the eastern Mediterranean. The expectation among both Ottoman strategists and horrified European observers was that this trajectory would continue, that Suleiman would advance incrementally and irresistibly, that Vienna would fall, and that whatever came after Vienna would be decided from positions of Ottoman strength. The halt at Vienna disrupted that trajectory. Not permanently, the Ottomans would remain a threat to Central Europe for another century and a half, and they would come within range of Vienna again in 1683, when a second great siege would be fought and decided. But in the specific moment of 1529, the failure to take the city meant something. It meant that the advance had a limit, that there was a point at which the logistical and seasonal constraints of pre-modern warfare imposed a ceiling even on the most formidable military machine of the age. Here is what history remembers about Vienna. It was a victory, and it was. But here is what history forgets. It was a victory shaped far more by geography, weather, and Ottoman strategic overreach than by the military genius of the defenders. The mud that swallowed Suleiman's heavy artillery on the roads north was a more decisive weapon than any arrow or arquebus fired from the walls. The shortness of the campaign season, the knowledge on both sides that winter was coming and that an army in the field without adequate shelter and supply would suffer losses no battle could produce, was a more effective defender of Vienna than Count Salm or any of his soldiers. This is not a comfortable conclusion for those who prefer their history as heroic narrative, but it is a more honest one and ultimately a more interesting one, because the lesson of Vienna is not simply that brave men can hold walls against overwhelming odds. The lesson is that even the most powerful military force of its era had structural limits. Limits imposed by distance, by season, by the fundamental physics of moving large numbers of men and heavy equipment across challenging terrain in pre-modern conditions. Every army in history has faced those limits. The greatest commanders in history are distinguished not by their ability to ignore those limits, but by their ability to recognize them before they become catastrophic. Suleiman recognized the limit at Vienna. He turned back in time to preserve his army. He lost the siege, but he did not lose the force. That calculation, that strategic patience, is actually characteristic of his generalship throughout his reign. He was not reckless. He was a man who understood that empires are built over generations, not campaigns, and that a setback in the field, properly managed, is recoverable. What is not recoverable is an army destroyed by winter on the wrong side of the Danube. And yet there is a cruelty in that analysis too, because the decision to turn back, rational as it was, left behind the prisoners who were executed when Suleiman's patience ran out, left behind the Balkan populations who had lived under Ottoman administration and whose lives were now bounded by this advancing and retreating frontier, left behind the question of what Europe would have looked like if the siege had somehow succeeded, a question that occupied European thinkers for generations afterward and that never entirely lost its power to disturb. Philip of Spain would reference Vienna when he assembled the Armada 60 years later. The poets and pamphlet writers of the 16th century returned to it as a symbol of providential protection that both comforted and unsettled them, because providence that depends on mud and weather is a more ambiguous kind of providence than the sort that arrives with obvious divine intention. The wall held, the city survived. The reasons why are messier than the survival deserves. Count Salm died of wounds received during the siege. He was 69 years old, had fought his entire life, and spent the last campaign of it organizing a defense that he did not live to celebrate. He was buried in Vienna with honors appropriate to a man who had perhaps saved the city, or perhaps held a position that the attackers were never quite capable of taking. The distinction, from his perspective, probably mattered less than the result. Suleiman the Magnificent continued his reign for another 37 years. He would campaign extensively in Persia, in the Mediterranean, and in the continuing contest over Hungary. He would become, in his own lifetime and in the centuries after it, one of the most celebrated rulers in the history of the Islamic world. his legal reforms, his patronage of architecture and arts, his administration of the empire, these would define his legacy as much as or more than his military campaigns. He is the Magnificent because of what he built, not merely what he conquered. The man who came closest to changing the course of European history built some of the most beautiful mosques ever constructed. He wrote poetry. He cultivated a court of extraordinary cultural richness. He also ordered the execution of his own sons when he believed they threatened the stability of his dynasty. He was a man of his era in all its complexity, ruthless and cultured, pious and politically calculating, capable of extraordinary mercy and extraordinary brutality, often in the same campaign. Vienna stopped him, or rather, Vienna and the mud and the calendar and the tactical stubbornness of 20,000 defenders stopped him, and stopped him just enough and just in time that the question of what Europe looked like in a world where the crescent flew over the Stephansdom remained hypothetical rather than historical. That question still echoes because empires always have limits. The question is always whether the people in their path know it in time. The final irony of the Siege of Vienna, the detail that reframes everything that came before it, is this. In 1683, 154 years later, the Ottomans came back. Another enormous army, another siege of the same city, and this time by an even narrower margin, with the defenders genuinely reduced to their last reserves and the walls genuinely about to give way. Vienna was saved by the arrival of a relief army at the very last moment. A cavalry charge down the slopes of the Kahlenberg that broke the Ottoman line and ended the last great Ottoman push into Central Europe. In 1529, the defenders held a line that the attackers were not quite equipped to break. In 1683, the attackers nearly broke a line the defenders could barely hold. The difference between those two moments, 154 years, two very different sets of circumstances, two very different outcomes that were both, in the end, the same outcome, is the distance between history as pattern and history as accident. Vienna held twice. The first time, it held because of what the Ottomans lacked. The second time, it held because of when the cavalry arrived. The city is still there. The Stephansdom still rises above the rooftops. The walls that Salm reinforced are long gone, replaced by the elegant Ringstrasse that the Habsburgs built in the 19th century. But underneath the ring, if you dig deep enough, you might still find traces of the earthworks that a 69-year-old count packed against crumbling medieval stonework in the wet autumn of 1529, trying to buy enough time for a season to end. He bought it. The season ended, and the world continued in the direction it was already going. Whether that was a miracle, a strategic miscalculation by the greatest general of his age, or simply a bad road in a wet spring, depends entirely on where you are standing when you ask the question.